So shall I just? Good evening, everybody, and thank you so much for tuning in to the Wellfleet Historical Society Speaker Series. We are grateful that you chose us to spend your Wednesday, July 21st evening with. And I'd like to just let everybody know that we have a special event coming up next Thursday at the museum. We have a Wampanoag potter. Her name is Carrie Helm, and she was in charge of the craft and education program at Plymouth Plantation. And she's a potter, and she made this beautiful piece of pottery that we have on display as part of the 1620 exhibit. So it will be at the museum live and in person outside next Thursday, July 29th at 10:30 in the morning. And I want to introduce our speaker this evening is Thomas Ryan, and I met Tom at a meeting of the Eastham 400, which started, must have been close to 3 years ago, I bet. And he was the only speaker at that event that talked about the First Peoples, which I thought was astonishing. But it forced me to go up and speak to him afterwards and introduce myself. And I had just started at the Wellfleet Historical Society only a few months earlier, maybe 1 month earlier. And we became friends, and he came to look at our Native American objects. And I have never found any conversation with him the least bit boring. It's the most interesting person to talk to, can talk for hours and hours and hours, can slip by talking about history or current events or just all kinds of topics. And one of the things I think I like best about speaking with Tom is his general interest in humanity, the way people are, and the way they treat each other. And he's got a great way about him. So I'm sure you're going to find his talk very interesting. I just would like to tell you that he is the vice chair of the Eastham 400. And he was the senior producer for all of those videos, 120 videos that you can see still up through a link on the Eastham Library. And he's a longtime leader of the Cape Cod Council of Churches and is currently chair of that council's Migrant and Refugee Committee, among many other things that he does. Without further ado, I'd like to hand it over to Mr. Ryan, our speaker for the evening.
Thank you, Cheryl, for your very generous introduction. And it has been a pleasure to know you these 3 years since you came to Wellfleet and I started with the Eastham 400. And I thank all of you who have registered and are watching this program this evening. And it's a pleasure for me to be here with you in Wellfleet, even though we're doing this at a distance, and some of you could be in Tokyo for all I know, getting ready for the Olympics. But we're going to speak about the town of Nauset that became the town of Eastham, which included Billingsgate, later Wellfleet, and Truro, and Orleans, and Chatham. So we're talking about the broader town of Eastham. So each time I use that word Eastham, we're going to talk about the pastor that you see here, Samuel Treat. And Samuel Treat was pastor for 45 years at Eastham. And when you hear Eastham, please think also Wellfleet, Truro, Orleans, Chatham. And his family, when Samuel Treat's father, Robert, was young, the family migrated to Boston. And they came off of these ships in Boston. And the family then, very soon from these ships in Boston, got themselves down to New Haven Colony. New Haven Colony, you see a map here, is the golden portion there of Connecticut. We have that map. There we are. And you'll see New Haven. And they prized being independent of the rest of Connecticut. And then in their early 20s, Robert and Jane Tapp were married. And a year later, in 1648, Samuel Treat was born to them there in New Haven Colony. He grew up in a much revered household, and most of Samuel's early schooling was at home with Jane and Robert here, rather formally dressed as the governor of Connecticut, which he became some years later. In his late teens, Samuel came to Massachusetts Colony as a student at 30-year-old Harvard College. The courses were all in Latin, and they had to know both Greek and Hebrew. While famous as the school for future clergy, there were no courses one now expects in a seminary: preaching, homiletics, liturgy, pastoral care, counseling, community leadership. So he was there in the late 1660s, graduating in a class of 7 young men in 1669. For sure, like students always, he heard of and was inspired by dynamic local leaders like this man here, John Elliott. From Elliott's nearby parish in Roxbury, across the very wide Back Bay from Cambridge, John Elliott was learning the Massachusetts language. He worked long days with some Massachusetts tribe neighbors, giving an oral language, an alphabet, a grammar, and a written form, a Herculean task. Then, having developed the language in a written form, he translated the scriptures from Hebrew and Greek into that native language. First, he did a book of Psalms, then the New Testament, and finally in 1663, the whole Bible. All of this just before Treat arrived in the neighborhood. I am sure that Treat learned Massachusetts language from Elliott and his team. Elliott did not do the translating and teaching as a purely academic exercise. He was out preaching in that language and forming communities of praying Indians. While he was away at school, New Haven Colony was forced to merge with Connecticut. Dad was very unhappy, so he led a group of dissidents who went to what is now New Jersey. And there, these pious Puritans founded, in 1666, New Ark. Upon graduation from Harvard, Sammy joined Dad and this 3-year-old town and stayed in the area for 3 years. 22-year-old Samuel, filled with Latin, Greek, Hebrew, and Massachusetts, was asked by Woodbridge, New Jersey, the oldest European town near Newark, to be their preacher. He is still listed today, here as you see on the screen, still listed on that church's website as their first pastor. Dad moved back to Connecticut in 1672, and Samuel came to Eastham in 1672. Almost 30 years prior, the Plymouth Court set these boundaries for the town of Nauset, soon renamed Eastham. The land line between sea to sea, from the Namscayket River, now the Brewster-Orleans line, to Herring Brook at Billingsgate, and all the meadows to either side, now the Wellfleet Truro line. And here we see another map. Eastham was the only town east of Yarmouth and the Bass River. Until they became incorporated as their own towns, other settlements came under a sort of guardianship of the established town. So all of Cape Cod from Bass River to later Provincetown was within Eastham. Samuel Treat arrived to a parish of that extent. And what did he see when he came? How did Treat reflect on this sharpening rock? the Nauset presence here from time immemorial? And what did he think about the many visible signs of their sustainability? And what else did he see? This windmill, now in Eastham, started elsewhere a decade after Treat arrived, with such buildings reminding Treat that the newly arriving English were also establishing an infrastructure of sustainability. Still another building, the home of the in-office governor of Plymouth Colony, was beside Treat's home. Prince was governor based here to 1673, a year after Treat moved into his new house next door. One wonders if Treat enjoyed this fruit, the fruit of Pence's very famous pear tree. Long after Prince and Treat's homes passed, the pear tree stood till just before Thoreau visited and wrote of this great pear tree and of all of Cape Cod. Treat had, as part of his salary, a home built for him on 20 acres of land, whose bounds were marked by stones such as this, one of which still exists. More importantly, Nauset, now Eastham, was two towns, two populations, two parallel governments, two parallel educational systems, two clusters of families with children, maybe meeting and maybe even marrying. The Nauset and their neighboring tribes on Cape Cod were in a definite majority in respect to the arriving English throughout most or all of Treat's pastorate. We can wrongly think of the Indians as living in a village down the road from Eastham. Wrong. They were everywhere in large numbers, with a few English having English-style homes sprinkled around. The aging governor and the new 24-year-old pastor just happened to be there amongst the Indians by the same pear tree. Alden Vaughan, over 50 years ago, told in his book, New England Frontier, of an old saying that the Pilgrims and their successors first fell on their knees, then on the Aborigines. The Treat arrived as an educated, experienced young Calvinist. In all summaries of his life, he is called Calvinist of the most strict kind. Yes, the stream of 16th century reforms initiated by John Calvin in Geneva. So I will spend a few moments here on discussing what is a Calvinist. And I want to share three replies: a dense reply, a diluted reply, and dressed reply. What is a Calvinist? A dense reply: none of us can do good under our own power. God acts first and mercifully welcoming us by his grace so that we can acknowledge our total depravity and trust God's love. Thus, in thankfulness, not fear, we try to live according to God's will for us. You have to take all those words and smoke on them for a few weeks. What is a Calvinist diluted? Treat was not a separatist rejecting the English way. He was from New Haven and Harvard and New Jersey, not a separatist from Leiden and Plymouth. In 1648, as Samuel was born, colonists from around New England joined in a synod at Harvard and celebrated a coming together of their various beliefs and practices and victory over papists. For years, there were synod meetings where all New England assented to the same theology. No more Pilgrims or Puritans, strict separatists and strict Calvinists, or those hoping for a Church of England finery. They were all sad at the seeming dilution of their specificity by compromise. Yet there was joy. The gathered clergy saw their grace-assisted accomplishment, a unified New England. They saw it as the first fully New Testament church since the Reformers started trying for that 150 years before. They saw it here in Boston, in Plymouth, in Massachusetts. They saw the Reformation taking flesh as it had nowhere else ever before, and the New Testament church taking shape as it never had before. And they sang Revelation chapter 19, verses 1 to 2. I quote, "After these things, I heard a great voice of much people in heaven saying, Alleluia, salvation and glory and honor and power unto the Lord our God. For true and righteous are his judgments, for he hath judged the great whore, which did corrupt the earth with her fornication, and hath avenged the blood of his servants at her hand. Alleluia, salvation and glory and honor and power unto the Lord our God. For the Pope is gone. There are no Catholics. Alleluia." Actually, it's Boston, so we say Alleluia. So what is the Calvinist? Here's the dressed answer. To distinguish and separate off the preacher, there was this gown similar to academics and judges, and at the neck, 2 stretched cloth pieces distinct from judges and academics. So there was a new Calvinist in Eastham. He came as a single man, but not for long. Within a year, he married Elizabeth Mayo, a local girl, not this woman on the screen. By the way, we're still looking for an image of his first wife, the mother of 11 children. When she died, he then married this woman on the screen, an urbane widow, daughter of the president of Harvard, Abigail Willard Estabrook. As the 1700s began, Abigail brought newer, less puritanical fashion to this far outpost, and they had 3 children. To qualify for incorporation as a town in 1646, the 49 colonists and their 7 families needed a meeting house. We are told that the first meeting house was 20 foot square. Could all 49 people fit in 400 square feet? Today's standards for a seated congregation call for at least 7 square feet per person. So allowing for a decent pulpit and some aisle space, the 49 plus the minister would just about fit. And that first meeting house was within Cove burying ground. I have always understood that it was expanded a few times in floor plan, and once by adding a belfry. The town record for 1678 reads as if it was a total rebuild. That's good, because the town census, as Treat arrived, was 520 people in 400 square feet, never able to fit in church for the mandatory presence. How did that work in those years? Something in our understanding needs to change. The church was much larger, which no archaeological evidence says, or very few came to church, not all by a long shot. If 50 fit and 450 were left out, they did not put 450 people into the stocks. When was the belfry added? 1681 is when town meeting approved the funding. 14 years later, the historians say it was added. Was this money held, and why was the work delayed? In any event, it shows the town and Treat to be radical. The first parish in county or state with a bell. By the way, we don't know where it is today. They probably allowed other musical instruments, to the horror of every other church around. In 1646, this beam, this darker wood beam, was on one side of the door. Its twin from the other side of the door is also in the Tool Museum in Eastham. We'll carry forward with other physical evidence of Treat and his colonist congregation. They might have had some version of hymn books, since they probably restricted hymns to psalm texts these would have been psalters. Or maybe each used his or her own Bible for the Psalms they prayed in community. The adults must have almost all been literate, and the literate almost all owned Bibles, probably the Geneva Bible. All in the Treat family who were old enough would have had their own Bible, and Samuel Treat had a family Bible that went to his widow and thence to one of their children. This photo is not the exact book, but Treat's family Bible has been located in the Massachusetts Historical Society and is very similar to what you see here. A manuscript note on the front flyleaf reads, "The Bible of Reverend Samuel Treat and his widow, Mrs. Abigail Treat, and the Bible of daily use of Robert Treat Payne, signed Charles Payne, 1842. Other physical evidence. In the congregations of New England, printed confessions of faith contained summaries of what they believed and what they condemned. Treat certainly knew how to get the boat to Boston, and records show him participating in clergy meetings early on and through the decades. One can see that he knew Massachusetts language early on. He assisted in the translation work for this confession in 1680, not 1699, what it says there on the bottom line. That was a reprint in 1699. It's unlikely he arrived in Eastham and only then started to learn how to speak with the Nauset, who were speaking a variant of the Massachusetts language. Two factors point that he had to have studied this at Harvard. Here, right here at this book with Grindal Rolson, only 11 years after Harvard, he knew the alphabet, he knew how to write, and of course, most Nauset were not probably yet literate. Only 11 years since school and only 8 years since New Jersey, here he is leading the field of clergy of Massachusetts in both translating and writing the native language, Massachusetts. Another physical piece of evidence. From the latter third of his years, we have Treat's cup or chalice. We can see the inscription ex dono, gift from Mr. Joshua Bangs, Mrs. Hannah Bangs, to the Church of Eastham, 1700. Several decades ago, a relative had it in her possession and says that the church gave it back to her family after the church was using it for generations. The Eastham Congregational Society still exists as part of the Federated Church of Orleans. She then sold it to the Museum of Fine Arts in the 1930s for $3,000. The MFA later sent it to Yale Art Gallery on permanent loan, and it's worth many hundreds of thousands of dollars now. One can imagine Treat using it, and its existence is a silent testimony to this strand of the Reformation, not ceasing the celebration of the Lord's Supper or communion, and allowing beauty to be at the service of community. The silversmith Jeremiah Dummer of Boston is now much appreciated for his pioneering work. And I can report to the church and to the town that your chalice is on view in New Haven, the colony of Treat's childhood. It is displayed with a great collection of other Dummer works. Now, I'd like to say a few words about the important work that Treat did among the Nauset in the center of Eastham, up north here, and what would become Wellfleet and down south in later Orleans. Here is the earliest, you see it here on the screen, the earliest seal or logo of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. The Native American words, the Native American is saying, you can see it coming out of his mouth, "Come over and help us." This is exactly from the Christian scriptures, Acts of the Apostles, chapter 8, verse 30. When Paul was in Asia Minor, in a vision he heard, "Come over to Macedonia and help us." For several years, Plymouth and then Boston did not reach out. But then Elliott arrived in Boston and Mayhew on the Vineyard, and a generation later, Treat was here in the first town founded by Plymouth. In filing reports to his boss, the overseer for ministers, Increase Mather, president of Harvard and congregational advisor, Treat wrote that each village of Nauset had a sachem leader, and the sachems met with Treat during the week when they planned the scriptures to be read and the sermon to be delivered by each in their own lawn houses on Sunday. Treat could not be everywhere. In Treat's later years, he reported to Dr. Mather that some Indian meeting houses were built around town to alleviate overcrowding in the sachem longhouses. This is an open field for research in Wellfleet. Where was this in what is now Wellfleet? The English congregation was required to gather on Sunday morning and then in the afternoon for a worship service that was centered on a sermon of at least an hour. I have found no record of what those from a great distance, those from Billingsgate, did for lunch and rest between the services down there at the Cove Burying Ground. In the mid-1800s, Thoreau wrote in the book Cape Cod, Mr. Treat is described as a Calvinist of the strictest kind, not one of those who, by giving up or explaining away, become like a porcupine disarmed of its quills, but a consistent Calvinist who can dart his quills to a distance and courageously defend himself. For centuries, fire and brimstone is what we called sermons that focused on hell. If there's one thing locals have heard about Treat, it's probably that he was full of fire and brimstone. Enoch Pratt wrote in 1844, he was a strict Calvinist, which is established beyond all dispute, with the advantage of preaching the doctrine of terror, which is naturally productive of a sublime and impressive style of eloquence. He could not attain the character of a popular preacher. His voice was so loud that when speaking, it could be heard at a great distance from the meeting house, even in the midst of the winds that howled over the plains of Nauset. Then and now, there are many preachers and parents and writers who use guilt to promote change, who foment how today is not at all as good as the early days. But it seems that our town hired for 2 generations an exquisite example of fire and brimstone. Here's a good example, as quoted by Thoreau, from Jesus' parable on a rich man who did well but went to hell, and the poor man Lazarus who went to the bosom of Abraham. Luke 16, verse 23, and from the netherworld where he was in torment, the rich man raised his eyes and saw Abraham far off and Lazarus at his side. On that verse, here is the howling preacher Treat. Thou must ere long go to the bottomless pit. Hell hath enlarged herself and is ready to receive you. Consider, thou art going to a place prepared by God on purpose to exalt his justice, a place made for no other employment but torments. Hell is God's house of correction. And remember, God doth all things like himself. When God would show his justice and what is the weight of his wrath, he makes a hell where it shall indeed appear to purpose. Woe to the soul that thou shalt be set up as a butt for the arrows of the Almighty. So much for that example. On the other hand, we have here some grave markers. Here we have in our region, it's easy to see in our broader town at Cove Burying Ground that there was a marked change in headstone art during the time of Treat. Look at what we see here. Death, skull and bones. This is Jonathan Sparrow, who died in 1707, is just to the right of Treat's remains in the cemetery, and his stone shows a fiercely toothy skull. Woe is me. But then you go to another part of the Cove burying ground, and some headstones have artwork showing a winged head, a cherub, and verdant or paradise vegetation. Here is Mark C. Freeman, who died in 1711, not long after Jonathan. This is the oldest cherub with wings on Cape Cod. There is also a beautiful heart surrounded by paradise and lush vegetation. Many consider it the apogee of art on Cape Cod in that era. The head of death motif becomes less and less selected as the head of paradise becomes even more popular in the years after Marcy Freeman. In the era of this burying grounds burials, the iconography of death was shifting from the skull and bones lament to a sense of heavenly paradise. Was this shift taking place in the preaching of Treat? Was it taking place in the minds of the deceased who left instructions? Or their relatives commissioning the stones? Or the carvers creating the art? Somebody was making a change, probably more than one circle. Yet this shift started here in our broad town on the Outer Cape, amongst the first places in America during Treat's pastorate. Did his preaching help parishioners move from skull and bones iconography to winged cherub? Was the sermon I quoted an early exception? Did his preaching future fears shift in his 45 years to preaching future hope and trust? Among God's frozen people, God chose people amongst God's chosen people were some 3 elder Mayflower passengers. All 3 were buried in Cove burying ground. Giles Hopkins, 65 when Treat arrived, Joseph Rogers, 65 when Treat arrived, and Constant Hopkins Snow, 67 when Treat arrived. See an example of one of their monuments, Constant Hopkins Snow. They lived and died in Eastham in Treat's pastorate. Did they melt into the crowd? The census 500 plus when Constant Hopkins Snow died. Or did they bear a certain witness? What, if anything, did Treat learn from them? Prince, as Plymouth governor from Eastham, lived next door for a year before his death. But the pears were ever there on that tree for the rest of Treat's life. Did this location influence Treat? And up the coast, here we have an image from King Philip's War a few years after Treat became pastor. Treat's mentor, Elliott, was aghast. You see him in the middle of this mural. Elliott was aghast as beloved praying Indians, the Natick Indians, were in chains and were sent to Deer Island for almost certain death. How was Treat influenced by this? Another aspect of his life, his dad was now governor from 1683, governor of Connecticut. How did that affect his son, Sam? Did they ever visit? Or another aspect of his life, in 1690, it was the French War and military was needed. King William's War was the North American theater of the War of the League of Augsburg. In his pastorate, the parish had to send some men to fight that war. Treat for sure helped pick who. He talked about sending them to hell. Meanwhile, also, the Massachusetts Charter formally established the province of Massachusetts Bay. How did Eastham and Treat feel about the end of Plymouth Colony? It was probably just as well that the 3 Mayflower passengers had just died before this. Perhaps worse, all of this happening during Treat's pastorate. The 1692 witch trial, Salem had to be known to Eastham. How would this have appeared in Treat's preaching? Whatever his preaching, he does not seem to have evoked the behaviors reported from Salem. Another aspect of life in Treat's time, there was slavery in the local colonies. Studies have yet to unearth, to my knowledge, reports of slave ownership in the broad town of East Ham, Wellfleet, Orleans. It was elsewhere in Barnstable County. It must have been here. Or were the locals resisting this plague? Did Mr. Treat preach on it? There are clear records of slavery in Truro after it became its own town after Treat. For example, we have the bill of sale of slave Hector from Jonathan Payne to Benjamin Collins for 30 pounds. Payne also purchased Pomp, kidnapped from Congo by a Truro whaler. With no large plantations, he became very lonely and he hanged himself from a tree in Truro. We must study our own town's history more closely. And here now, I'll speak for a few moments about his salary. And I quote Thoreau in good humor. In 1662, Eastham agreed that a part of every whale cast on shore be appropriated for the support of the ministry. No doubt there seemed to be some propriety in thus leaving the support of the ministers to Providence, whose servants they are, and who alone rules the storms. For when few whales were cast up, they might suspect that their worship was not acceptable. The ministers must have sat upon the cliffs in every storm and watched the shore with anxiety. And for my part, if I were a minister, I would rather trust to the bowels of the billows on the backside of Cape Cod to cast up a whale for me than to the generosity of many a country parish that I know. Thus wrote Thoreau. For whatever reason, they went to money for supporting Mr. Treat. There was no paper money yet, and few coins from England made it here. So they minted local shillings, and they stated his salary at 50 pounds. At 20 shilling per pound, that would be about 1,000 of these coins each year, if they could find that many. A trusted source says that in today's money, his pay was $12,626. He twice later received pay raises, 10 pounds each time. He also got 20 acres of land beside the governor's pear tree, and as much wood as he needed delivered to his door. Town meeting records show that the town provided him with other provisions for his maintenance. So his salary, 50 or more pounds, 20 acres and more land, a large house, unlimited wood, and provisions. Far better than the occasional whale. Town records show that in at least 1 year, even as his family grew, he gave back his salary because the town's economy sank that year. The key reward or compensation was neither shilling nor wood, but the love and care showered on him by the Nauset and by the colonists. This image, a much beloved image, shows a locally famous story of death and burial. In March of 1716, or 1717 using the new calendar, Treat died during a horrific blizzard. His family was isolated in the house with his body, surrounded by enormous snowdrifts. Grieving Native Americans arrived, who dug a tunnel through the drifts and brought his remains to co-burying ground for burial. And these apt words were placed on his headstone. Here lies interred the body of the late learned and Reverend Mr. Samuel Treat, the pious and faithful pastor of this church, who, after a very zealous discharge of his ministry for a space of 45 years, in laborious travel for the souls of the Indian natives, fell asleep in Christ, March the 18th, 1716-17, in the 69 year of his age. Here's a curious tale. This headstone here with that message was stolen in the 1800s. And this much simpler stone replaced it, a much less informative stone. In the 1900s, the original stone was found in a barn in Orleans, but Orleans refused to return it, putting it in its library instead. A mid-century fire there is said to have destroyed the stone. Some say fire doesn't destroy stone, and it is hiding in Orleans still. Now we move to another gravestone, this of Josiah Oakes. As if Old Man Treat were holding back some changes, several took place right after his 1717 death. First, in the South Precinct, a meeting house was built and a minister hired for what would later that century be independent Orleans. Second, up here in Billingsgate, John Doane III lived by what is now called Taylor Hill Cemetery. Here, a small meeting house was built, the first of Billingsgate. Josiah Oakes in 1718 settled here. He had earlier been visiting from time to time, returning to Boston each time. Third, in the central part of town, a new meeting house was built on what is now Bridge Road. So, Josiah Oakes is a key man in the early history of Wellfleet. He had been visiting for years and now was a well-educated man with an important father who had been Speaker of the House in the legislature in Boston. We don't know why he refrained from applying to be the minister in the southern part of Eastham or in the new meeting house in the central part of Eastham. Instead, he chose to commit to tiny Billingsgate. On June 7th, 1718, soon after the death of Treat, John Doane III presented a petition to the town meeting of Eastham, asking for an independent Billingsgate. Town meeting said no. 3 days later, Josiah Oakes and his dad, the former Speaker of the House, petitioned the General Court in Boston, praying that Billingsgate be set off and constituted a distinct township. It did not pass in the House. So Eastham was ready to allow north and south sections to have their own meeting houses and ministers, but not a formal political separation in 1718. As already noted, Billingsgate had its first meeting house a year after Treat died. Up at the Taylor Hill Cemetery, here's this marker. Sorry for the shade. It reads probable site, first meeting house, 1718 to 1840. 3 years into the meeting house and 3 years with Josiah Oakes preaching. On March 14, 1721, a number of Billingsgate residents drew up a document, quote, having for several years with good agreement supported the gospel ministry among us, and having met to consider the most proper method for the founding of a Church of Christ in this place, we have made the choice of Reverend Mr. Josiah Oakes to dispense the word in ordinances among us. This would eventually lead on the broad foundation of Treat, and the local foundations quickly begun upon Treat's death. This would lead eventually to the First Congregational Church, celebrating this year its 350th anniversary. So Mr. Treat is peculiarly entitled to a distinguished rank among the first ministers of New England in his zeal and labors. And I'll conclude with these words of 1930 historian by the name of Kitteridge. Such men as John Lathrop, Richard Boyne, and Samuel Treat are titanic figures in the history of the Cape. Theirs was the task of setting a spiritual and intellectual standard that should permeate every phase of life. Righteous themselves, they demanded righteousness in their followers, and within the limits of human nature, they got it. Their example gave strength to the weak and courage to the faint-hearted. Amen. And I thank very much Lydia Hollick and Katie Crowell, who assisted me with the images for this 59 images. Thank you very much, ladies.
Okay, if you can unscreen share, we could have a Q&A. And there's a,
Screen. Okay,
if you click the screen share green icon at the bottom, again, it will stop the screen sharing.
okay, they're having a little technical difficulty
Yeah.
with that.
It's not showing. It's just.
Hmm.
Can you end it, Jennifer?
Let me see.
If you turn yours off, hmm? Can you turn it up? Just turn it off.
There you go.
Okay, here we are.
Okay, great. So if people want to ask questions, you can either, it's a small enough group so you can unmute yourself or raise your hand, or you can, if you don't want to talk on camera, feel free to put a question in the chat and I can ask Tom myself. And thank you for that very, very interesting presentation.
Welcome.
I have some questions.
Cheryl?
I may be remembering things from your previous talk or things that I've read, but there's a bunch of things, many things that I'm wondering about, but one that I was surprised about was that it seemed like Treat had 3 or 4 Native people who were, I don't know if they were ordained or if they were had gone to Harvard, and that they were the preachers in the Native American preaching houses, the Nauset or the Penanaconet or whoever the people were, and that we still don't really know where those houses were, if they were indeed houses of worship and not just somebody's Witu. And do you see any further research being done on this, or do you think it's a dead end?
I don't think it's a dead end. Ron Peterson, who's on the chairing the Orleans Historical Commission, has been doing a lot of work in the south part of our metropolitan area, down in Orleans, into the exact location where those meeting houses would have been for the praying Indians. It's all the evidence seems to be that for the first decades in the late 1600s, those who converted to Christianity, and it was most of them did, met in the longhouses of their sachems, which was the largest gathering possibility within their village or settlement. And whether it was the sachem himself or herself or another leader, there was a different leader in each of those longhouses, preaching, reading the scriptures and preaching according to their agreement earlier in the week at their common meeting with Treat. These leaders, from everything we know, did not go to Harvard, did not go to any school, were only recently literate, in the sense that their language was not a written language until Elliott. So they were very early converts themselves. And it's an amazing feat. People often talk about the fact that he converted so many Native Americans to be praying Indians. And I'm saying the infrastructure that he set up and the way that he did the training and sharing was an incredible effort and success that he set that up. So much so that there were so many of them that by 1700, there was a felt need to not meet in the longhouses, but to have other buildings. Some have said, how come they didn't have common services with the English? The first reason is because of language, that Almost none of them spoke English, and almost none of the English spoke Wampanoag. So it was language was probably the reason. Some might say that there was a bit of racial animosity. There might have been some of it, but certainly linguistically, they needed to be separate. So there's lots more research needed. Where do they meet? Where were those places? And where were they buried?
Yeah.
A couple things in the chat. Sheila says, many thanks to Mr. Ryan for this wonderful presentation of the history of the beginnings of the First Congregational Church of Wellfleet, which is celebrating its 300th anniversary. We are appreciative. And then Jeff asks, please describe briefly the alternative to Calvinism.
The alternative to Calvinism or the alternative? Yep. First of all, let me apologize. I believe I did say 350, which is wrong, of course. It's the 300th anniversary, 1721 to 2021. So I apologize for my typo. When in the 1600s, there were many reformations within Christianity in Europe. One of them was started by a man by name of Martin Luther. Those folks got to eventually be called Lutherans. John Calvin was in Geneva. He started a movement that eventually is called by the name Calvinists. There was Bucer in Strasbourg. There was Henry VIII and his bishops in England. They had a Reformation there. There were many Reformations in Europe. Each of them had their own tradition begun, and eventually those various traditions reached North America. Catholicism, which was most of Europe before the 1600s, that also came to North America through New France and New Spain. And there were reformations within Catholicism as well. So there were many different reformations, each of them producing a lifestyle, a rule book, a way of interpreting scripture, alternative to the strict Calvinists.
Thank you. Deborah, do you have your hand up? You have to unmute yourself.
Okay, did that work?
Yep.
Okay. So I went to a different part of what you were saying, Tom, and I'm not sure if I got the words exactly right, but you referred to the bangs, the silver bangs cup that was given to Samuel Treat, or made for him originally. Do I have that part right?
It was given to the Church of Eastham
Right.
during the period while Treat was the pastor. So it would not have been owned personally by Treat. It would have been owned by the Church of Eastham, which went from Truro to Chatham, of course, at the time.
Right.
And the church owned it. And
Yeah.
in my opinion, frankly, in my opinion, still does.
Yeah.
But
Right. Okay. So, and you said beauty in the service of the community.
yes,
Were those just your words, or were you?
those are my words. Yeah.
Yeah. Right.
I do believe, I work a lot on social justice issues, and there are many people who say we don't have time for issues of art and beauty. And I believe that art and beauty do serve justice and do serve the social good.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So I believe that silver chalice in some way was serving the common good and the poor of Eastham
Mm-hmm.
better than it does now, perhaps in a museum.
You're right. I was just going to say, what are we going to do to bring that home?
Well, that's more than I can answer at this moment.
Another project. Okay.
We should have at least one cup of coffee, Debbie, and talk about that.
Thank you. And you referred to the doctrine of terror. I'm sorry. I don't want to be greedy here. Did someone else?
I thought Bill had his hand up, but I wasn't sure.
Oh, okay.
No, maybe not. Go ahead.
The doctrine of terror was a way of referring to the fire and brimstone style of
Yes,
Samuel Treat, right?
yes, and that was right, and I was quoting other sources for that. I personally believe that there was some defense for fire and brimstone not being meant to terrorize, but it was meant to make people feel guilty.
Mm, mm. Okay, well, clearly this idea of him having the influence of getting from the skull and bones to the heart and angel cherub with wings implies that through his preaching, perhaps there was a kindness that grew.
Right. It certainly says to me that you cannot say only one thing about the man. You cannot just say fire and brimstone. He was a complicated human, like all of us.
Mhm,
And I don't mean complicated in a negative way. I mean in a very positive
mhm.
way.
In the chat, we have, is there any written record of how the Native Americans received the Bible in their native language?
I'm sorry, how they received.
Yes. I don't,
Even though, of course, there's two ways to think of this question. One is the physical process of printing. It was the first, it ended up being the first book printed here, in here meaning Boston. So the Wampanoag language or Massachusetts language of Bible was the first book published in Boston. And then they would have been bookstores, and then they would have been, I'm sure, somebody on had hundreds of copies on a cart and would bring it to the tribes, the villages, recognizing the problem was that nobody read. There was no literacy, because in the course of making that Bible, they were inventing the written form of that language. So receiving it by the tribe would have taken generations, because it would have followed the track of literacy. The other meaning of receive is the psychological reception of this. How did they receive the scriptural words? That comes to the whole question of, was conversion to Christianity a good thing, a bad thing, a neutral thing? Was it forced? Was it open? I mean, there's many, many things to say about the process of conversion to Christianity that happened. And to remember always that Christianity, as Judaism, started as a Mesopotamian religion. And in those words, before it ever went to Macedonia or Europe, it was Mesopotamian and Palestinian religion. And so it made some great cultural adaptations in Europe as it did in other continents. So there's a lot to talk about enculturation also about this topic. All for another night sometime.
Okay, well, it's 8:01. So I don't know if Cheryl, you have any final words.
Well, maybe one question that comes to mind are like, how many kids did he have? And this family, that there are a lot of people who claim to be descendants of Samuel Treat. I know several. Someone's raising her hand right now. And I lost track. How many children did he?
13, I believe.
13. And did they
And
all live?
I'm sorry, I'm not a specialist in that. So some may have died near birth.
Mhm.
Some may have reached adulthood and had their own children. Clearly, there were some of them, but I'm sorry, I don't know the breadth of that family tree.
It does
But
seem like a family that prospered.
It certainly is. And one of the grandsons was the first Supreme Court judge for Massachusetts. when it was a independent state after the revolution. And many other treats pains became leaders in Massachusetts through the early 1800s. So it became a very important family.
Well, I can't thank you enough for this really interesting talk, and I'm curious about learning more about Samuel Treat and just what it was like. It's so funny, or one of the things that strikes me in studying this period in history is that we want pictures or artifacts or papers or objects, and there aren't that many. I mean, there's no photographs, obviously, but it's not even like, you know, studying ancient Rome, you know, to get a clear idea of what it was like in, you know, Eastham, in the place to the north of the Bass River on the Cape in the early 18th century, late 17th century. It's really difficult to get a picture of what it was. What was it like here during the King Philip War? What was life really like here, and what were the relationships really like between the native peoples and the Europeans? So if anybody out there has any diaries or first primary sources of any accounts of their people who came before us and how they related to each other, I think there's a lot of interest.
And that goes especially for church archives. There are many, many early congregational churches in our towns that haven't looked in the back of their closets to see some of this material. I want to thank the library and the Historical Society Museum for inviting me. And it's always great to have an audience, and it's always fascinating to look at this history. So I thank you.
You're very welcome, and we will have you back when we can all be in person together.
Thank you.
Good night, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.